In this video, we'll take a look at CSS Grid. And what CSS Grid is a way to lay out pages. Traditionally in web design, you could lay out pages with tables, or you could lay it out with floats, or absolute and relative positioning. Grid is fairly new, but it's a very powerful tool for laying out pages. Now, this is going to be just an overview of how CSS Grid works. So you can see here, I'm in CodePen again. I have an HTML with a section that has 10 items, and they have classes of items. In my CSS, I'm just doing some basic resets. I have some background color stuff, fonts, and every item has a background color and a border and a font size. So now we're ready to start making the grid. So the first thing you need to know about grid is how it works. So the container, the outer container, is the parent. It's the grid container. It's called the grid container. And the container will have items inside of it, and that will be the children of that parent container, or the grid items. So that's we have here. We have grid items. Now, without grid on, the natural flow of these items, since they're div elements, they're all block level elements, and they have their own border, they have their own padding, they have their own margins. But the way that this page is laid out right now, you can see that it just goes down, and all these items are one on top of each other. So let's see what happens when we turn on grid. So I have my section tag here. And what I want to do is I want to turn grid on. So it's like Flexbox. So with Flexbox, we say display flex, but with grid, we say display, and then we say grid. Now, nothing's going to happen when you set this and turn this option on, because you need to further define either the columns or the rows. So right now, there are no columns or rows that are defined. So in grid, we have grid template columns or grid template rows. So I'm going to start with grid template columns. And here you can specify columns in a couple of different ways. The first way I'm going to do this is, let's say that I want 3 columns. So I'm going to say 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. So I'm defining 3 columns at 200 pixels wide, and you can see exactly what happens here. So all of that content got pressed down and pushed into this grid. So this grid is basically saying, put all the content into 3 columns that are 200 pixels wide. So because this is a fixed unit, there's not going to be any flexibility or responsiveness to this, but you can see what's happening. Each of the columns are represented here. Now the rows get automatically generated. So the browser is doing a lot of the calculations and figuring out what's going to happen. So once I get to row 3 here, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to drop down to the second row and create a new row and create a new row. So some things in grid are explicit, meaning that's things that you set. So the grid template columns that I set here are explicit. I said I want 3 columns that are 200 pixels wide. What's implicit is the rows, right? So I didn't say that I want 4 rows, but that's what's happening here. So, and that's what happens when you start splitting things up into grid template columns or rows. So another value that you can add is a grid gap. And the grid gap, I'll just make it 10 pixels. That will just push the items away from each other. So now we actually have a gap. Now, in traditional HTML, CSS with positioning, this is really tough to do. But with grid, it's really easy to do. Now, those columns can be broken up. Right now, they're broken up into pixel values, but we can make one of these auto. Like, for example, if I say 200 pixels and I make this one auto, what will end up happening is that this center section now, this first column is always going to be 200 pixels wide. This last column is always going to be 200 pixels wide, but that middle column is going to be flexible. So it's going to adjust. It's going to be responsive to whatever is available. So the browser is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's doing a lot of the work. Now, another thing for grid template columns is that we can, instead of using pixel values and marking out your columns that way, you can use something called a repeat value. So if I say repeat, and then I say, let's say that I want 5 columns, and each column is going to be 100 pixels wide. So now I have all of my grid elements are laid out. So I have the 5 columns, and each one is 100 pixels wide. So when it gets to 5, it goes down to the next row and creates another row. Now, if we add in rows, so if I say grid template rows, and I say I want the first one to be 200 pixels high and the second one to be 400 pixels high, that will control the height of the rows. And again, this would be really hard to do in traditional HTML development with CSS, but with grid, it's really, really easy to do. So you can define that rows by itself without the columns, or you can define them both together. So it's completely up to you. And we'll take a look deeper into grid and see how things, how can we use grid to lay out something more practical. But for now, this is just an overview of what we can do with grid.